The morning Marshal Granger did not leave was the morning Catherine Sutton was dying. He had his boots on. He had his saddlebag packed, the worn leather straps buckled tight the way he always buckled them before first light crept over the red ridge to the east. He had done this exact thing 7 times across the span of 3 weeks. He had slipped out of the narrow cot in the back room of the Sutton homestead, while the darkness still held dominion over the land, while the coyotes still called to one another across the dry creek bed, while Catherine's breathing was slow and even and unknowing. He had pressed his hat to his head, pulled the door shut behind him without a sound, and ridden south into the blue-black pre-dawn as though the territory itself were chasing him. He was good at leaving. It was, in fact, the only thing Marshal Granger had ever truly mastered. But this morning, the 7th morning, there was no slow and even breathing from the back room. There was a sound that stopped his blood cold. A thin, desperate sound, half gasp and half moan, followed by the unmistakable crash of something heavy striking the pine floor. Marshal stood at the door with his hand already on the latch, his horse already tied to the post outside, the whole architecture of his habitual disappearance already assembled around him. And still that sound reached him, slipped through the old wood and the brittle morning air, and found the one living thing inside him he had spent 11 years trying to bury. He released the latch. He turned around. He crossed the room in 4 strides and threw open the back door, and found Catherine Sutton collapsed beside her bed, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face the color of candle wax, her left hand pressed hard against her ribs. He was on his knees before he was even aware of deciding to move. "Catherine," he said, and his voice came out raw and strange, like something dragged up from very deep water. Her eyes found his, and in them he saw the flicker of terrible surprise, not the surprise of someone caught being unwell, but the surprise of someone who had fully expected to be alone. "You are still here," she whispered. 3 weeks earlier, Marshal Granger had ridden into the New Mexico territory with nothing more than a tired horse, $40 in coin, and the kind of silence around him that men acquire not from peace, but from years of deliberate isolation. It was September of 1878, and the land between the Pecos River and the Jornada del Muerto was the color of old bone. The summer rains had come and gone without much conviction, and the arroyos were dry again, and the whole wide country looked scorched and resigned, the way things look when they have been beautiful and know it will not last. He had come through Roswell and kept going west, following no particular purpose, which was how Marshal Granger had navigated every year since 1867. He had been 22 then, when the war ended and left him standing in a Virginia field with nothing to go back to and no direction that felt right. He had drifted west the way water drifts downhill, not from intention but from the simple absence of anything solid enough to stop him. He had worked cattle drives through Texas, had spent 2 years as a deputy marshal in Abilene before the hidden motive behind that arrangement, which was a crooked sheriff who wanted a useful gun rather than an honest law, had driven him out again. He had prospected briefly in Colorado, had driven freight through Wyoming in the brutal winter of 1872, and had learned in all of those places what he had been trying to disprove, which was that he was not a man who stayed. It was not cruelty. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, as he rode those long, empty miles. He had no dark past of abandoned women and broken promises, or not precisely that. There had been a woman in Abilene named Louisa who had believed he was staying when he was not, and he still carried the weight of that particular failure like a stone in his chest. He had told her the truth about himself as plainly as he knew how to tell it, but the truth about a man who cannot stay is a truth that sounds theoretical until the morning his horse is gone and the bed is cold. He had been 33 years old that September when he rode through the low Pinon Hills and came upon the Sutton homestead, and what brought him to the gate was the most mundane of reasons. His horse had thrown a shoe 2 miles back and was going lame, and the homestead was the only structure visible in any direction for as far as the eye could reach. The property was a quarter section of dry grassland with a house, a barn, and a kitchen garden that was fighting valiantly against the season. Someone had painted the porch posts blue, which struck Marshall as an act of stubborn optimism in a landscape that rewarded very little optimism at all. There was a wagon with a broken axle propped against the barn, and a water pump that needed priming, and everywhere the evidence of a single pair of hands doing the work that two or more pairs were required to do. He called out from the gate the way a man does when he means no trouble, identifying himself as a traveler with a lame horse. And after a moment, the front door opened, and Catherine Sutton stepped onto the blue-posted porch with a Winchester, repeating rifle leveled at his chest, and the calm, evaluating expression of a woman who had learned to answer her door that way. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes that were a shade of gray-green that Marshall would later spend considerable time trying to describe to himself and consistently fail. She was not tall, but she held herself as though she were, and the rifle in her hands was not a prop. She knew exactly what she was holding. "State your business precisely," she said. "I have heard the general version and I am not interested in it." Marshall appreciated the economy of that. He stated his business precisely. His horse had thrown a shoe. He needed the use of a forge, or at minimum a place to rest the animal and himself, until he could arrange transportation to the nearest town, which he believed was Cimarron Creek, approximately 14 miles northwest. Catherine Sutton looked at him for a long time with those gray-green eyes, and then she lowered the rifle 2 inches, which was not all the way but was enough. 14 miles is correct," she said. "The forge is in the barn. I have nails and stock shoes. Can you shoe your own horse?" "Yes," he said. "I can." "Then you can use the forge," she said. "There is a water trough by the south wall. Do not come into the house until I know more about you." He thought this was entirely reasonable. He dismounted and led his horse through the gate, and that was how it began. Her name was Catherine Elaine Sutton, and she had come to the New Mexico Territory 3 years prior with her husband, Daniel Sutton, who had filed on the quarter section under the Homestead Act of 1862, and who had died 14 months later of a rattlesnake bite that became infected before any medical help could reach him. She had stayed. This was the fact about Catherine Sutton that Marshall found himself returning to again and again in those first days, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone to understand its weight. She had stayed. She had buried her husband under the cottonwood tree by the dry creek. She had taken over the filing and the cattle records, and the water rights negotiations with the men at the county seat who did not want to negotiate with a woman, and she had stayed. The forge was cold when Marshall got to it. He lit it himself and spent 3 hours working the shoe into shape, while the sun climbed, and the September heat settled over the property like a lid placed over a pot. When he was done, he shoed the horse, and then he stood in the yard with the animal and wondered what the polite length of time was before he should leave, and found himself instead picking up the broken tongue of the wagon because he could see exactly what was wrong with it and he happened to have the tools. Catherine came out at noon with a tin plate of beans and cornbread and a cup of water, and she set it on the fence post and stepped back and said, "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said. She watched him work for a moment. "You fixed the pump this morning as well. The leather cup was cracked. I had a replacement piece in my bag. I did not ask you to do that." "No," he said. "You did not." She stood there in the September sun, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, some small recalibration of the distance she was keeping. "What is your name?" she said. "Marshall Granger." "Where are you going, Marshall Granger?" "West," he said, which was the honest answer and also the answer that communicated everything about him that mattered. She nodded once, as though she had expected this, and went back inside, and Marshall ate the beans and cornbread standing at the fence post and tried not to notice how good they tasted. He told himself he would leave the next morning. He woke before dawn and lay in the barn loft where she had offered him a blanket and a patch of clean straw, and he looked at the stars through the gap in the roof boards, and he thought, tomorrow, west. He had thought this same thought the morning he left Abilene. He had thought it the morning he left Colorado City. It was a thought with a kind of ritual comfort to it, like a prayer said often enough that the words still work even when the faith has thinned. But in the morning, there was a problem with the kitchen garden that he could see needed addressing. A section of the fence had come down overnight, and the 3 goats Catherine kept had gotten in and done damage, and he could see from the look on her face when she discovered it that the garden was not decorative but essential, that the winter stores it represented were not supplementary but necessary. He spent the morning rebuilding the fence section, and most of the afternoon helping her replant what could be salvaged. She did not thank him effusively. She was not that kind of woman. She brought him water and said, "You are still here," and the way she said it was not quite a question and not quite not a question. "I am leaving tomorrow," he said. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said nothing, which was somehow worse than if she had said something. This became the pattern. Marshall Granger, who left everywhere, kept finding reasons that felt real and immediate to stay one more day. There was the matter of the water rights dispute, which he accompanied her to address at the county seat in Cimarron Creek on the 3rd day, because a woman going alone to negotiate with Amos Creddy, who held the upstream water rights and was known to be difficult, seemed to Marshall like a situation that called for a witness at minimum, and a man willing to look Amos Creddy in the eye at best. The negotiation was tense and unpleasant, and Creddy did several things that made Marshall's jaw tight, but in the end the seasonal water access agreement was renewed, and Catherine drove the wagon home in silence for 6 miles before she said, "Thank you." "That man is a problem," Marshall said. "That man has been a problem since Daniel filed the homestead claim," she said. "He believes a widow without a man has no legal standing. He is wrong." "Yes," she said, "he is. But being wrong has never diminished a man like that." He looked at her profile in the wagon seat, the sharp, clean line of her jaw, the way she held the reins with both hands and her attention entirely on the road, and he felt something shift in his chest that he chose not to examine. "I am leaving tomorrow," he said. She did not say anything. She clicked to the horses and they went on down the dry road toward home. He did not leave the next day, or the day after that. He left before dawn on the 5th day, truly left, got 2 miles out and sat on his horse on a rise looking back at the homestead in the blue-gray light before sunrise, at the dark square of it against the paler dark of the scrubland, at the faint orange ember of the lamp she had already lit in the kitchen window, because Catherine Sutton woke before dawn every day without exception and began working. And he sat there on the rise for long enough that the sky began to change, and then he turned his horse and rode back and tied it to the post and went around to the barn and lay down on the straw and stared at the roof boards until full daylight came. He told himself it was the season. Late September in that country was not a good time to be on the road without a fixed destination. He told himself it was the horse, which had been hard used and needed rest. He told himself it was any number of sensible and logistical things, and none of them were true, and he knew it. What was true was that Catherine Sutton was the most genuinely alive person he had encountered in 11 years of drifting, and being near her felt like being near a fire after a very long time in the cold. They fell into a rhythm that felt almost dangerous in how natural it was. Marshall worked the property, addressing the list of deferred repairs that every undermanned homestead accumulates, and Catherine managed the kitchen garden and the livestock and the correspondence and the accounts. And in the evenings they sat on the blue-posted porch while the sky turned colors that Marshall had not previously known the sky was capable of, and they talked. Not about the future, never about the future, because Marshall did not discuss futures he did not believe in, and Catherine seemed to understand instinctively which topics he would close at the edge of. They talked about everything else. About the war, carefully, and without the particular rawness that the topic still carried for some men his age. About the territory and its politics and the Comanche and Mescalero Apache, and the ongoing and deeply unjust dispossession that the federal government was conducting with its customary combination of broken treaties and coordinated force, about which Catherine had strong and well-articulated views that surprised him, and then did not surprise him at all, because he was learning that surprise was the wrong lens for Catherine. She thought carefully, and she spoke carefully, and the things she said were worth listening to. She told him about growing up in Ohio, the second daughter of a school teacher and a woman who kept books for 3 separate businesses, which explained her competence with accounts. She had come west not out of desperation, but out of genuine desire, because Daniel Sutton had been a good man with a real vision and she had shared it, and the fact that the vision had not survived Daniel did not mean she was willing to abandon it. "Do you not get lonely?" Marshall asked one evening and then immediately felt the clumsiness of the question, but Catherine considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. "Yes," she said. "But there is a difference between loneliness and solitude, and I have mostly made peace with the second even when the first is uncomfortable." Marshall looked at the horizon. "I have lived alone for a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "It shows." He glanced at her, uncertain whether this was criticism, and found her looking at him with something that was not quite amusement and not quite something else. "I did not mean it unkindly," she said. "What does it show?" He asked, which was not a question he would normally ask. She thought about it. "You are very self-contained," she said, "and very careful about everything. You think about where the door is before you sit down. You eat quickly, you sleep light, I think, and you are very generous with your hands and your labor and very careful not to be generous with anything else." Marshall was quiet for a while. "That is a fair accounting," he said. "I am not criticizing it," Catherine said. "A man alone in the world for long enough learns to carry himself like that. I just notice it." "What do you notice about yourself?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the last color leaving the sky. "That I am too stubborn," she said. "That I confuse not asking for help with being strong. Daniel used to say I would argue with a fence post about who had the right of way." A ghost of a smile crossed her face and then faded, and Marshall felt the tenderness of it, that particular ache that belongs to grief that is no longer acute but never fully absent. "He sounds like he knew you well," Marshall said. "He did," Catherine said simply. "It was a good marriage. I do not pretend otherwise, and I do not pretend the grief of losing it was small." She looked at Marshall directly. "But I am also 26 years old and alive, and I am not going to put a stone over my own life and call it loyalty to the dead. Daniel would have hated that." Marshall looked at her for a long moment and felt something very specific happening in his chest that he had been trying not to name for 12 days. "No," he said finally, "I do not imagine he would have." The silence after that was the kind that has a different quality than the silence before. Marshall was aware of it. He believed Catherine was also aware of it. Neither of them said anything about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. He left before dawn the next morning. And the morning after that, and the morning after that. He packed his bag quietly in the dark and got his horse and rode south and came back. Every time he came back he did not announce it. He simply returned and went to the barn and took up whatever work was waiting, and Catherine did not comment on his return or his absence. She brought him water at noon and called him to supper in the evening and sat with him on the porch and they talked. And every time they talked, the walls he had built around himself over 11 years were subjected to the same patient, inadvertent erosion that water applies to stone, not intentionally, simply by being water. What he was doing, and he knew it, was trying to find the moment of departure that would hold. He was riding out before dawn to remind himself that he could, to reassure himself that the option remained open, that the instinct was still there and functioning. He was a man who had defined himself by leaving, and leaving before Catherine woke was the only way he knew to keep that definition intact. As long as he left before she opened her eyes, As long as she woke each morning to an empty barn rather than a man at her kitchen table, the situation remained theoretical. It remained something he could still walk away from without having to acknowledge what he was walking away from. She knew he was leaving. He was certain of it. Not because she said anything, but because Catherine Sutton was not a woman who missed things. She woke before dawn. She surely heard his horse. She surely noticed the pattern of his absence and return. And she said nothing, which he understood as a particular kind of generosity that cost her more than she showed. The thing that changed everything was Amos Creddy. It was in the third week of October, on a Tuesday, 3 days before the morning Catherine collapsed. Marshall had ridden into Cimarron Creek alone for supplies, leaving Catherine to manage the morning feeding. He came back in the early afternoon to find 2 of Creddy's men on the property, one of them near the barn and one of them on the porch, and Catherine standing in her doorway with the Winchester again. But this time, her face was different from how it had been the morning he first arrived. This time, there was something behind the careful composure that Marshall recognized as fear that was being refused its natural expression. He came through the gate at a canter, and the 2 men turned to look at him, and he took in their posture, which was the posture of men who had been told they could do as they liked because there was no one here to prevent it. Marshall Granger had spent 11 years doing his best to stay out of other people's difficulties. He had a policy about it. The policy was that involvement led to stakes and stakes led to reasons to stay, and reasons to stay were the one thing he could not afford. He sat on his horse and looked at the situation for approximately 2 seconds, and then dismounted and walked toward the man on the porch, with the kind of walk that men who have seen real violence learn to recognize. "Get off this porch," he said. He did not raise his voice. He had found that a lowered voice in the right circumstances carries considerably more weight than shouting. The man on the porch was large and had the easy confidence of someone who had not recently been challenged. He looked Marshall up and down. "And who are you supposed to be?" he said. "The wrong man to be talking to right now," Marshall said. "Get off this porch and tell Amos Creddy that his people are not welcome on this property." There was a long moment during which Marshall held the man's eyes and did not look away, and during which the man performed his own calculation. Whatever he concluded, he stepped off the porch. He and his companion exchanged words at the gate and then rode away, and Marshall turned and looked at Catherine, who was still holding the rifle with both hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. They were making a point, not a physical threat. A pause. This time, what did they want? What they always want, for me to sell the water rights and the South acreage. Creddy has been after the South acreage since before Daniel died. Her voice was steady, but he could see the fine tremor in her hands on the rifle barrel. "He thinks if he makes it difficult enough I will give up and go back east." "Will you?" Marshall asked. The look she gave him was answer enough. "This is my land," she said. "Daniel and I filed on it together, and I am the surviving title holder, and I am not going anywhere." "Then we need to address Creddy in a more definitive way," Marshall said. "We," Catherine said, and there was something in the single word that made him feel it like a physical thing. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, and discovered he meant it. They sat up late that night at the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them and the territory maps spread out and Catherine's record books open, and they went through everything. The water rights agreement, the land title, the homestead claim documentation, the correspondence with Creddy, the testimony Catherine had documented from neighboring homesteaders who had experienced similar pressure. Marshall had enough experience with territorial law from his time as a deputy to understand the legal landscape, and what he found as they went through the documents was not only a strong case for Catherine's position, but also evidence that Creddy had been operating well outside legal bounds in his pressure campaign. "This," Marshall said, pointing to a letter, "this is a written threat. This has legal weight." "The county judge is friendly to Creddy," Catherine said. "I have not wanted to rely on local authority. The territorial governor's office then, and possibly the federal land office in Santa Fe." Creddy's operations have a federal dimension if he is interfering with a homestead claim. Catherine looked at him across the table, and the lamp made the light fall across her face in a way that did something he could not account for, something that made it hard to focus on the maps. "You know quite a lot about this," she said. "I was a deputy for 2 years," he said. "I learned how the law works and how it gets bent." "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment. "The man I worked for was not what he represented himself to be," he said. "I was being used to give legitimacy to things that did not deserve legitimacy. When I understood that, I left." "You left," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only a careful noting. "I left," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment. The lamp flickered. Outside, a coyote sounded very far away. "Marshall," she said quietly, and just the way she said his name, just the particular weight and care of it, made something in him go very still. "Do not," he said. He said it gently, almost like a plea. She held his gaze. "I was not going to ask you to stay," she said. "I was going to say that whatever you do or do not do, I am grateful you were here today, and that I have been grateful every day." He looked at the lamp. He looked at the maps. He looked at his own hands on the table. "Catherine," he said. "You do not have to say anything," she said. "I know," he said, and then said it anyway. "I have been trying to leave. I need you to understand that. Every morning before dawn, I pack my bag and I leave, and then I come back, and I do not know how to explain that to you except to say that I am not a man who knows how to stay. I have never learned it. And you are a woman who deserves someone who stays without a daily battle with himself over it." "What you are describing," Catherine said, slowly and carefully, "sounds to me less like a character flaw and more like a wound that has never been treated." He looked at her then properly, and what he saw in her face was not pity and not the bright, hard sympathy of someone trying to fix something. It was the steady regard of a woman looking at a person she understands. "What made you stop staying?" she asked. "Originally, what happened?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the lamp burned lower and he reached out and adjusted the wick without thinking about it. "My family died," he said, "when I was young, not in the war. Before the war, in 1857, there was a fever. My mother and my younger brother and my sister. My father lasted 2 years more before he simply stopped trying to continue." He paused. "I was 17 when it started and 20 when it finished. And by the time I was 20, there was nothing left to stay for, and I had learned that the things you stay for disappear." Catherine was very still and very quiet. "So you stopped making things to stay for," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is not strength," she said gently. "That is the cleverest kind of hiding I have ever heard of." He looked at her and felt the truth of it land in him like something physical. "I know," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and she did not say anything. And the weight and warmth of it was the most dangerous thing anyone had done to Marshall Granger in 11 years. He left before dawn the next morning. He sat on the dark rise 2 miles out and felt the wrongness of it like a bone set crooked, and came back and spent the day working the south fence line with a kind of concentrated fury that was all the things he was not saying channeled through a post-hole digger and wire. The morning after that was the morning he found her on the floor. He was on his knees beside her, and she was pale and sweating, and her breathing was wrong, shallow and fast, and she had pressed her hand against her side, and the look in her eyes was pain managed and barely. And he thought, very clearly and very coldly, about what it would mean if she died. He thought about how he would have been 2 miles down the road, riding away, and what the shape of the rest of his life would look like with that knowledge in it. He pushed the thought aside because she needed him present and not calculating, and he said, "Catherine, can you tell me what it is?" Sighed, she said. "Pain started 2 days ago. I thought it would pass." 2 days. She had sat on the porch with him 2 evenings ago and talked about the Cimarron land grant controversy, and he had not known she was in pain. "Can you walk?" he asked. "If you help me," she said. He got his arm around her and lifted her carefully and got her onto the bed, and then he did a rapid inventory of what he was looking at. The pain was in her lower right side, and her abdomen was rigid, and she had a fever he could feel radiating from her skin without touching her forehead. He had seen this before in the war, the particular medical emergency that the surgeons called inflammation of the bowel, the kind that came on suddenly, and if left untreated became fatal with a speed that left no margin for slow decisions. "I am going to ride to Cimarron Creek for the doctor," he said. "Dr. Haverson," she said. "He is generally at his office on Lincoln Street." "I know where it is," Marshall said. He stood and then hesitated, looking at her. "Catherine," he said. "I will be fine," she said, with the stubbornness that was entirely characteristic and at that moment both maddening and precious. "Go quickly." He went quickly. He pushed his horse as hard as he dared on the October-hard roads and made the 14 miles to Cimarron Creek in a time that cost the animal considerably and himself nothing, because fear had made him weightless. Dr. Haverson was indeed at his office on Lincoln Street. A compact, serious man in his 40s with a black bag, he picked up without being asked as soon as Marshall described the symptoms. "How long has she had the fever?" Haverson asked as they came out to the horses. "I do not know. She hid it." Marshall's voice was flat and controlled. "And the abdominal rigidity?" "Yes. Right side lower." Haverson's expression confirmed what Marshall had feared. "We need to go now," the doctor said, which was all he said, and they rode. The ride back was the longest 14 miles of Marshall Granger's life. He spent the whole of it making a bargain with whatever governed the universe, the terms of which were simple and non-negotiable. He would not leave. If she lived, he would not leave. He would put down every piece of armor he had constructed over 11 years, and he would stay, and he would learn how to be a man who deserved to stay. And he would do it imperfectly and stubbornly, and with all the difficulty that such a transformation required. But he would do it. He would do it because she was worth doing it for, and because, if he was honest, which he was finally willing to be, he had known that from the second day. He had known it, and he had been terrified, and he had kept packing his bag before dawn and riding south, and coming back, because terror is a powerful mechanism, and one he had been running on for 11 years. Catherine was conscious when they returned, which Haverson said was good, and her fever was no worse, which Haverson said was also good. The doctor examined her thoroughly and with professional efficiency, and his diagnosis was, as Marshall had feared, an acute inflammation that had the potential to become something far more dangerous if not addressed aggressively. He had with him the medicines available in 1878, which were limited, but he had also training in the supportive care that was the main tool in situations like this, rest and fluids, and the reduction of fever and vigilant monitoring. "She needs watching through the night," Haverson said to Marshall quietly at the bedroom doorway. "If the fever spikes or the pain intensifies significantly, you ride for me again immediately. I want to be back out here day after tomorrow to reassess." "I will be here," Marshall said. Haverson looked at him with a clinical regard that was not without perception. "You are not a relative," he said. "It was not a question." "No," Marshall said. "A neighbor, a friend," Marshall said, and the word felt inadequate and also exactly right. Haverson nodded. "She is fortunate to have a friend," he said. "This country is very large and very empty." Marshall sat beside Catherine's bed through the night, which was October long and cold and lit by a lantern turned low, and he watched her breathe and kept a damp cloth on her forehead, and changed it when it warmed, and listened to the coyotes and the wind, and the complete and total silence of a territory that neither knew nor cared about what was happening in one small room in a homestead 14 miles from the nearest town. Sometime after midnight, Catherine woke and looked at him sitting in the ladder-back chair beside her bed and said, "You are still here," and the particular quality of her voice when she said it, the exhaustion in it and the something else, the something that was not quite belief and not quite its absence, went through him like a cold wire. "I am still here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Marshall," she said, "do not talk, save your strength." "I will say one thing," she said, and her voice was rough with fever but her eyes were clear and direct. "When I woke up yesterday morning and you were gone, I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I had known what you were from the first day and I had made no claims and was owed nothing. I told myself I was a practical woman, and practical women do not allow themselves to be hurt by the exact things they were warned about. He was very still. Catherine. And then I found myself on the floor, she said, and the first thought I had before the pain was relief that I had been wrong and you were still there. She paused. That is a shameful amount to tell a man who has told you clearly he does not stay. It is not shameful, he said. It felt shameful. I know. He reached out and covered her hand with his, the same gesture she had made across the kitchen table, returned. I need you to get well, he said. And when you are well, I need to tell you something that I should have said a week ago. What is it? She said. When you are well, he said firmly. I am not going to die, Marshall, she said, with a flicker of the acerbity that was so characteristic of her that it actually made him feel better in a way that nothing else had managed to. It would be very inconvenient at this particular moment. No, he said, you are not going to die. She slept not long after that, and Marshall sat in the chair and did not sleep at all. And when the sky began to lighten in the east, he sat and watched it and did not pack his bag and did not saddle his horse and did not go anywhere. He was still sitting there when the light came fully up and the rooster in the yard announced the morning, and Catherine opened her eyes again and found him in the chair where she had last seen him. Still here, she said softly. Still here, he said. Her fever broke late that morning, which Haverson, when he came on the second day, said was the best possible outcome. The inflammation had not progressed to the feared worst case, and with continued rest and the treatment he prescribed, she would recover fully, though the recovery would take several weeks of genuine rest that she would, he predicted accurately, resist. You will have to enforce it, Haverson said to Marshall. I am aware, Marshall said. She will not like being enforced upon, Haverson said also accurately. No, Marshall agreed. She will not. Catherine was, as predicted, a terrible patient. She spent the first 3 days accepting the constraint of rest with reasonable grace, and the 4th day announcing that she was perfectly capable of managing the morning feeding. And who did Marshall think he was, exactly, making decisions about what she was or was not capable of? Marshall sat across the room from her and let her finish, and then said calmly that Haverson had said 4 to 6 weeks of genuine rest, and it had been 4 days, and she was not going anywhere except back to sleep. And then he went and made her coffee and brought it to her, and she took it with bad grace and drank it and did not go anywhere. On the 5th day she asked him to bring the account books to her bed, and he did, because rest did not require intellectual inactivity, and a woman like Catherine Sutton would recover faster if her brain had something useful to engage with. He sat in the chair beside her, and they worked through the books together, and he watched her color return and her eyes sharpen, and something he had been holding released slowly. On the 8th day, he finally said what he had told her he would say when she was well. He had pulled the chair to the window because the morning was clear, and the light was coming in at a low October angle that turned everything gold, and Catherine was sitting up in bed with the account book closed on her lap because she had been watching him and waiting with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that patience was more effective than pressure. I told you I was leaving, he said. Every morning. I told you I was going west. Yes, she said. I am not going west, he said. I am not going anywhere. If you will allow it, I would like to stay. The silence after that was particular. Catherine looked at him with the gray-green eyes, and he held her gaze and did not flinch from it because he was done flinching from the things that mattered. You left every morning for 3 weeks, she said. Yes. And came back every morning. Yes. Why did you not simply stay the first time? Because I was afraid, he said, which was the truthful answer and the only one he had. She was quiet for a moment. What are you afraid of? She asked. The same thing I have always been afraid of, he said. That the things you choose to stay for disappear. They might, Catherine said. That is true, they might, she looked at him. But they definitely disappear if you leave. He thought about this. Yes, he said. I have known that, I think, for a while. I just did not know what to do with it. And now, she asked. And now I am choosing to stay, he said, with all the risk that comes with it, if you will have me. Catherine looked at him for a long, serious moment. There was nothing easy or automatic in her expression. She was not a woman who gave herself to sentiment without examination, and she was not examining this with anything less than her full intelligence. He respected this about her. He would have been less certain of her answer if she had given it immediately. "You would need to actually stay," she said. "Not conditionally. Not with a packed bag behind the barn. I cannot be a woman who wakes up wondering every morning whether the man she has chosen is still there." "I know," he said, "and you would need to understand that this is my land and my homestead, and I am not in need of a man to run it for me. I have run it alone for 14 months. "I know," he said. "I would not want to run it for you. I would want to work it with you." "There is a difference," she said. "I understand the difference," he said. Another silence, this one of a different quality. Catherine looked out the window at the October morning, at the blue-posted porch and the dry grass and the cottonwood by the creek where Daniel Sutton was buried, and whatever she was thinking in that moment Marshall did not try to read. After a long time she looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." Marshall breathed. He had not been aware of not breathing until he breathed again. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she said, and there was the ghost of a smile. "You will have to prove it every day for the rest of your life." "I know," he said. "I expect I will." She recovered slowly and impatiently and completely. By the third week of October she was out of bed and managing the kitchen garden again, and by the 1st of November she was doing full days. Marshall worked alongside her through the autumn preparation, the stacking of feed, the weatherproofing of the barn, the laying in of stores against the winter. They worked well together, which Catherine noted, and Marshall noticed her noting, with a kind of satisfaction that was quietly mutual. The matter of Amos Creddy did not resolve itself simply by being addressed. In the second week of November, Creddy himself came to the property for the first time, not with his hired men but alone, which was more alarming rather than less, because a man who comes alone to deliver a message is either harmless or he believes his message does not require enforcement. Creddy was a thick-set man in his 50s with a prosperous belly, and the kind of authority that comes from 20 years of being the most powerful man in a particular county. He sat on his horse at the gate and looked at Marshall and Catherine standing on the porch with the mild and unfocused aggression of a man who is not used to being told no. "Mrs. Sutton," he said, "I heard you had company." "Mr. Creddy," Catherine said, "I am not aware of issuing an invitation." "This is a social call," Creddy said, which it evidently was not. "I wanted to introduce myself to your friend." He looked at Marshall. "Marshall Granger, I have heard your name." "I expect you have," Marshall said. "Former deputy in Abilene," Creddy said. "Then considerable wandering," he said, "wandering the way people say disreputable. You have settled here, have you?" "Yes," Marshall said. "For how long?" Creddy asked. "Indefinitely," Marshall said. Creddy looked at Catherine and then back at Marshall, and performed a calculation that Marshall could see clearly, and which was a more honest expression of his purpose here than anything he had said. He was here to assess whether the change in Catherine's situation, specifically the presence of a man with a known history in law enforcement, changed his own calculus. "I want you to know," Creddy said, with the careful pleasantness of a man who is used to framing threats as courtesies, "that my offer for the South acreage remains open. A fair price. The widow benefits and so does the territory." "The widow," Catherine said, with a particular tone, "has a name and a land title and is not interested in Mr. Creddy's offers at any price." "Perhaps you might give it more thought," Creddy said, and looked at Marshall again. "A man planning to stay for the long term might want to consider what kind of neighbors he is acquiring." "I have considered it," Marshall said. "I have also considered that the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe has a significant interest in homestead claims being honored as the law requires, and that we have documented correspondence that suggests a pattern of interference with a legal land holding that I believe they would find instructive." Creddy's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it did. "You are welcome to contact whoever you see fit," he said. "We have already done so," Marshall said, which was not entirely true yet but would be true by the end of the week, because he intended to draft the letter that same evening. I mention it only as a matter of good neighborly communication." Creddy looked at them both for a moment longer and then touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse and left without another word. Catherine watched him go and then let out a breath she had been holding. "Did you actually contact Santa Fe?" she asked. "Not yet," Marshall said. "I will tonight." "You lied to Amos Creddy," she said. "I gave him accurate information about my intentions," Marshall said. She looked at him sidelong. "That is a very particular kind of honesty," she said. "I learned it in law enforcement," he said. She laughed, which was the first time he had heard her genuinely laugh, and it went through him like light through water. They sent the letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe that week, with copies of all the relevant documentation. The response took 3 weeks, but when it came, it was substantive. The land office confirmed Catherine's title and noted the correspondence regarding the water rights dispute and the documented pattern of interference. The letter also, by happy accident of bureaucratic efficiency, went to the same county seat office where Judge Halliwell, who was Creddy's friendly judge, had his chambers, and the formal governmental attention from Santa Fe had the immediate practical effect of making Creddy very quiet. He would not be permanently quiet. Marshall understood this. Men like Creddy had patience and resources, and they did not abandon their ambitions merely because the opposition had organized itself temporarily. But the organized opposition had bought time, and time was useful. In the winter months, Marshall settled into the homestead the way a man settles into a life he has chosen with full understanding, which is to say imperfectly, and with daily recommitment. He still had mornings when the old instinct woke with him, when his body reached for the packed bag before his mind had fully surfaced, when the open road sent its particular call across the dark and the cold. He had told Catherine about this honestly, because he had decided that honesty with her was the thing he could give that cost him most and therefore mattered most. "Does it get easier?" she had asked, one November evening by the kitchen stove. "Somewhat," he said. "Every day I stay is a day it gets somewhat easier." "Good," she said, which was characteristically economical. December in the New Mexico Territory was cold and sometimes brutal, and they were often confined to the house by weather that made outdoor work impractical, and this was, in the way of confined spaces and shared warmth, its own kind of crucible. They learned each other in the particular way that close quarters teaches, all the small textures of daily habit, the way Catherine read in the evenings with her feet tucked under her, and her brow furrowed slightly, as though the book had said something she was not prepared to concede. The way Marshall's hands were never still when he was thinking, always finding something to mend or adjust. The way he made coffee too strong, and she made it too weak, and they had negotiated a middle ground that satisfied neither of them entirely and both of them sufficiently. It was on a December evening with snow coming down outside, and the stove making the kitchen warm and close that Marshall kissed her for the first time. It was not dramatic. She had been telling him about something she had read, and she had turned to look at him to make a point, and the look between them shifted, the way it had been shifting for 3 months, and he reached out and put his hand along her jaw, and she went still, and then he kissed her with everything he had been holding back since September. She kissed him back with the same thoroughness that she applied to everything she did, which was to say completely and without reservation. When they stopped, she put her hand flat on his chest and looked at him with the gray-green eyes and said, "Marshall." "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I am staying. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a moment longer, and whatever she was reading in him, she appeared to find it sufficient. "Good," she said, and the word was small and warm and everything. The winter was long and cold, and they were together through all of it. And when spring came back to the New Mexico Territory in March of 1879, it came with the particular violence of relief, the brown land going suddenly, almost overnight, to green, the dry creek running again with snowmelt, the kitchen garden stirring under the surface, and Marshall Granger working the homestead alongside Catherine Sutton, with the ease of a man who has been somewhere long enough to know where everything belongs. He had written letters. He had written to a woman in Ohio, Catherine's older sister, whose name was Ruth, and to a law office in Santa Fe that was handling a small matter from his Abilene days, and he had received letters in return. And all of this correspondence was the ordinary correspondence of a man conducting the practical business of putting down roots. He had not noticed, until Catherine pointed it out one March morning, that he had begun referring to the homestead as home. "You said come home for dinner," she said over breakfast. "Did I?" he said. "You said it to yourself, I think. You were out at the barn and I heard you say it under your breath." He looked at his coffee cup. "I suppose it is home," he said. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." He looked up at her and she was looking at him in a way she had not looked at him before, or perhaps she had been looking at him this way for some time and he had only now learned to read it correctly. It was a look of complete and unguarded trust, which was the most dangerous thing one person can offer another and the most generous. He put down his coffee cup. "Catherine," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you are willing, I would like to do this properly." The silence that followed was the kind he had learned to wait through rather than fill, because Catherine's silence was always processing rather than absence. "You are not proposing because you feel obligated," she said, "because you have stayed the winter." "I am proposing because I love you," he said, which was the first time either of them had used the word, and saying it felt like taking off heavy armor he had forgotten he was wearing. "I have loved you since approximately the second week of September, when you argued with me about the Comanche water rights for 45 minutes and were entirely correct and knew it and were not smug about it, which I found, God help me, almost unbearably appealing." She stared at him for a moment and then she laughed again, that genuine, full laugh, and he thought he would do almost anything to keep hearing it. "That is a very specific moment," she said. "I remember it precisely," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Marshall Granger." "Yes," he said, and the word was a key in a lock he had thought was rusted shut. They were married in April of 1879 at the small church in Cimarron Creek by a minister named Reverend Alderman, who was about 70 years old and had married couples in that territory since before the war, and had seen every variety of human pairing, and seemed to find Marshall and Catherine's particular combination entirely unremarkable, which was, Marshall thought, the most reassuring possible response. Catherine wore a blue dress that was the same shade as the porch posts and looked, when she walked toward him down the short aisle with her sister Ruth, who had come from Ohio for the occasion, like something Marshall did not have adequate words for. Ruth Sutton was 2 years older than Catherine and looked enough like her that the resemblance was immediately apparent, with the same sharp, evaluating intelligence in her eyes, and she had looked at Marshall across the dinner table the night before the wedding with the frank and unambiguous regard of an older sister conducting an assessment. "Catherine tells me you used to leave every morning," she said. "Ruth," Catherine said. "It is a fair observation," Marshall said. "I did." "And you stopped," Ruth said. "Yes," Marshall said. "Why?" Ruth asked. "Because I found I could not," Marshall said. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "That is the most honest thing I have heard a man say in some time," and poured herself more coffee, and the assessment appeared to be concluded satisfactorily. The ceremony was attended by a small group, the minister and his wife, Ruth, Dr. Haverson, who had become something of an ally and a friend, and 2 neighboring homesteading families, the Delgados from 3 miles south and the Birch family from the Eastern Road, who had also experienced pressure from Creddy, and with whom Marshall and Catherine had developed a genuine alliance over the winter. Miguel Delgado and his wife Esperanza had brought food for the reception, tamales and rice and beans, and a cake that Esperanza had baked, and the small party after the ceremony was warm and generous and felt, to Marshall, like the first time in his adult life he had been part of a community. He said this to Catherine that evening, after the guests had gone and Ruth was settled in the spare room, and they were sitting on the blue-posted porch in the April night air, which was warm enough and full of the sound of the returned creek and the frogs and the insects of spring. "The first time," she said. "The first time in a very long time," he said. "The first time it felt like something that included me rather than something I was observing." She leaned against his shoulder, which was a new thing, the ease of it, the simplicity of leaning. "You are not only observing," she said. "You are here. You are fully here." "Yes," he said, "I am." They sat like that in the April night, and the creek ran and the frogs called, and the stars came out over the territory with the absolute abundance of stars, in a place that has not yet been lit by anything more than candles and oil lamps. And Marshal Granger held his wife and felt the full settled weight of a life chosen. The summer of 1879 brought with it the expected and the unexpected in roughly equal measure. The kitchen garden flourished under the attention of two people rather than one, and the cattle operation, which Catherine had maintained at a modest scale through necessity, expanded somewhat under the additional labor. Marshall had sold his horse to buy a second draft animal, which improved the farming considerably, and had written to a cattle broker in Cimarron Creek about purchasing additional stock in the fall. The unexpected came in July, in the form of Amos Creddy, who had apparently decided that the quiet of the winter and spring represented not resolution but patience. He brought with him in July not his hired men, and not a formal courtesy call, but a legal instrument, a suit filed in county court challenging Catherine's title on the grounds of a claimed prior interest that Creddy asserted predated the homestead filing. The claim was largely fabricated, which Marshall could see clearly, but fabricated legal claims required legal refutation, which required time and resources that were not trivially available 14 miles from the nearest town. Marshall sat with Catherine and the legal filing at the kitchen table, and went through it with the same careful attention he had given the other documents the previous autumn. And what he found, on reading it fully, was not only its weaknesses but a specific and important piece of Creddy's strategy. The claimed prior interest relied on a survey from 1865 that Creddy was asserting had established his rights before the Homestead Act filing in 1875. The survey document he had submitted as evidence was, Marshall believed, not what it was represented to be. "He has falsified a survey document," Marshall said. "Can you prove that?" Catherine asked. "I can if the original survey records are at the Territorial Land Office," Marshall said, "which they should be if the survey was legally conducted." "Santa Fe," Catherine said. "I need to go to Santa Fe," Marshall said. Catherine looked at him steadily. "How long will that take?" "There and back with time at the land office, perhaps 10 days, he said. He met her eyes. "I am coming back, Catherine." "I know you are," she said, and she said it without the careful qualification that she would have used in September, without the checking that had been necessary then. She said it the way a woman says something she knows. He rode to Santa Fe in August, which was a hard ride in the summer heat but straightforward enough, and spent 4 days at the Territorial Land Office with a methodical patience that the archivists seemed to find unusual in people who came for records. He found what he was looking for on the 3rd day. The original 1865 survey records showed a boundary that was inconsistent with Creddy's submitted document in 3 specific locations. The alterations were subtle enough that a non-specialist might not notice them, but they were there, and Marshall had them certified by the chief surveyor of the Territorial Office with a signed and witnessed statement. He also, while in Santa Fe, arranged a meeting with a territorial attorney named Alejandro Reyes, who had a reputation for taking land rights cases on contingency when the evidence was strong. Reyes looked at the documentation Marshall had brought and was quiet for a long time and then said, "This is not a defense case. This is a prosecution case." "I had begun to think the same thing," Marshall said. "Falsifying a land document for submission to a court is a serious crime in the territory," Reyes said. It also tends to illuminate a pattern, and patterns are useful. There are other homesteaders, Marshall said. The Delgados to the south, the Birch family to the east. And I believe Creddy has made similar moves against at least 2 other properties in the last 5 years. If they are willing to bring their documentation, Reyes said, I believe we can construct a case that goes considerably beyond your wife's homestead claim. Marshall rode home in 9 days and brought the certified survey comparison and the name of Alejandro Reyes, and after a brief stop at the Delgado place and the Birch farm, commitments from both families to participate in the broader legal action that Reyes was assembling. Catherine met him at the gate in the late afternoon and looked at his face and said, "You found it." "Yes," he said. "All of it." "More than we needed," he said. "Creddy is going to have a very difficult year." She took his horse's bridle while he dismounted, which was the kind of small, unremarked assistance that is the language of a working partnership, and said, "Ruth is visiting again." "Is she?" he said, with a certain resigned affection for his sister-in-law that had developed over the spring. "She is deciding whether to stay in Ohio or come west," Catherine said. "What is pulling her west?" Marshall asked. "The Delgados have a cousin," Catherine said mildly. Marshall looked at her. She looked back at him with the gray-green eyes entirely innocent. "Is the cousin a good man?" Marshall asked. "Miguel speaks very highly of him," Catherine said. "He is coming to work on the Delgado property in September." "Ruth is coming in September," Marshall noted. "She is," Catherine said equally. He shook his head. "You arranged this," he said. "I arranged for 2 people who might be good for each other to be in the same territory at the same time," Catherine said. "What they do with that is their business entirely." He took her hand. "You are a deeply strategic woman," he said. "Yes," she agreed without apology. "Are you hungry? I made stew." The legal case against Amos Creddy moved slowly, as legal cases do, but it moved with the particular inexorability of a matter that has genuine documentation behind it. Alejandro Reyes came to the territory in September to take formal testimony from Catherine and from the Delgados and the Birch family, and what assembled itself across 3 days of careful legal work was a pattern of land fraud that extended back 7 years and involved 5 properties and a systematic effort to dispossess legitimate homesteaders, many of them widows or immigrant families who Creddy had calculated were least likely to have the resources to resist him effectively. The county judge, who was Creddy's friend, recused himself from the case when the territorial attorney general's office became formally involved. The judge who replaced him was a territorial appointee named Hargreave from Albuquerque, who had no particular friendship with Creddy and a considerable professional interest in making an example of land fraud. Creddy was indicted in November of 1879 on 3 counts of document fraud and 2 counts of interference with federal homestead claims. The homestead suit against Catherine's title was dismissed with prejudice. Creddy's quiet between summer and autumn, as his lawyer attempted various maneuvers, was the quiet of a man whose hidden motive had been exposed and whose power was rapidly reconfiguring itself under him. The trial was set for February of 1880, and Marshall made himself available as a witness, which he had not done under his own name in any legal matter since Abilene, because it required him to surface from the anonymous drifting that had been his cover for 11 years. He did it without hesitation. He had given up the cover. He had given up the anonymity. He had chosen to be a person with a name in a specific place, and this was what that meant. Catherine sat beside him in the courtroom gallery in Cimarron Creek on the first day of the trial and held his hand, and he felt her steadiness flow into him, the way warmth flows from a fire, simply by proximity. Creddy was convicted in March of 1880 on 2 of the 3 counts and sentenced to 4 years in the territorial prison in Santa Fe. The land fraud verdict was entered into the public record, which had the further practical effect of unwinding 2 of the other disputed property claims in the county. The Delgados and the Birches held a celebration that involved a great deal of food and Miguel Delgado's guitar, and lasted until well past midnight on the property line between their two claims. Marshall stood in the warm March night on the Delgado land and listened to the guitar and watched the firelight and felt the particular and unfamiliar peace of having seen something unjust made less unjust, not fully righted, because the years of pressure and fear, and the years before that when Creddy had succeeded against smaller or more isolated homesteaders could not be undone, but moved, definitively, in the right direction. Catherine stood beside him and took his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a long time without talking, which was its own particular and abundant conversation. In the spring of 1880, Catherine told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning in April, almost exactly a year after their wedding, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window, and she said it with the directness she brought to everything, and then watched his face with an attention that told him she was not entirely certain what she would see there. What she saw was Marshall Granger standing very still for approximately 4 seconds and then crossing the kitchen in 3 strides and putting his arms around her with a care and a completeness that communicated, without the inadequacy of words, everything he felt about it. "Marshall," she said, muffled against his chest. "Yes," he said. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said. "I am very all right." She pulled back enough to look at his face. What she found there, he knew, was not the particular terror that had been his response to attachment and permanence for 11 years. It was something different, something that had replaced it not by force but by the slow daily practice of choosing to stay. "I was afraid you might be afraid," she said. "I was afraid I might be afraid," he admitted. "I am not." She looked at him a moment longer with those gray-green eyes, reading him with the thoroughness she had applied to him from the first day. "No," she said, "you are not." The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Dr. Haverson monitored with the brisk and reassuring competence that Marshall had reason to be grateful for. Ruth, who had in fact stayed in the territory, having found the Delgado cousin, whose name was Ernesto Vega, to be exactly what Miguel had represented, came and went from the homestead with a regularity that Marshall had initially found overwhelming and had come to value more than he expected. She was a practical and extremely useful presence, and she and Catherine together at the kitchen table in the evenings, talking over coffee, had a specific warmth to them that made the house feel full in a way it had not been before. Ernesto was a quiet man with a deep and evident affection for Ruth that he expressed primarily through attentive labor on her behalf, fixing things before she asked, appearing with coffee at the precise moment she needed it, listening to her with the complete attention of someone who finds the person they are listening to genuinely fascinating. Marshall recognized the condition. He was sympathetic to it. The child was born in November of 1880. A boy, which Marshall had thought he wanted and discovered on the actual occasion that what he wanted was whatever was healthy and here, and a boy was those things entirely. He stood in the room afterward when Haverson and Ruth had done what needed doing and Catherine was exhausted and radiant and the baby was wrapped and in her arms, and he felt the word permanence not as a threat but as a gift. "What shall we name him?" Catherine asked. He had thought about this. He had thought about his father and his brother, and he had thought about what names carry and what they mean. "Daniel," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him with something that went very deep. "Daniel," she said softly. "Yes." She looked down at the child and then back up at him. "Come and sit beside us." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child, who was small and red and emphatically himself, and put one careful finger against the tiny fist, which closed around it with a grip of irrational certainty, the grip of a creature who has not yet learned to doubt that what it holds onto will hold. "He looks like he knows what he wants," Marshall said. "He is your son," Catherine said dryly. He looked at her and she was smiling, that full genuine smile, tired and brilliant and entirely hers, and he thought about September of 1878, about the packed bag in the dark, about 2 miles down the road before first light, about the rise from which he had turned back 7 times, and he thought about the morning he had not turned back from the house at all, the morning he had found he simply could not leave. And he looked at Catherine and Daniel, and the room that was his home, and he understood finally and completely that what he had been doing for 11 years, all that distance and all that motion and all that practiced departure, had been the longest possible way to arrive at the only place he had ever actually wanted to be. He had thought the instinct to leave was his nature. He had believed it was the truth about him, the essential and unalterable fact. And it had been for long enough to last a decade, but it had not been unalterable. It had been a wound, as Catherine had told him the night before the trial, and wounds that are tended heal, not without a scar, not without the knowledge of what they were, but they heal, and the healed place is stronger than the place was before. The winter of 1880 was mild by the standards of the territory, which was to say it was cold and sometimes brutal, but not catastrophically so. And they kept the house warm with the stove, and with the wood that Marshall had cut through October, and Daniel grew with the brisk determination of a healthy infant who had strong opinions about eating and sleeping and being held, primarily that all three of these should happen constantly and on his schedule. Marshall discovered in those winter months that he was good at being a father in the same way he had been good at the work of the homestead, not naturally and automatically, but through the investment of his full attention, through learning the specific language of the specific person in front of him, through understanding that being good at something like this is not a talent but a practice. Daniel slept best, he discovered, when held against Marshall's shoulder with one large hand supporting his back, and Marshall spent considerable time in the early mornings with the baby in this configuration, standing at the kitchen window, watching the pre-dawn dark over the territory and feeling it, the darkness before first light, the hour that had for so long been the hour of his departure. Now it was his hour of arrival, into the morning, into the day, into the life he had chosen. Catherine came downstairs one morning in December to find him at the window with the baby, and she stood in the kitchen doorway wrapped in her robe with her dark hair loose and her eyes soft with sleep, and she looked at them both, and something in her face was the exact expression he had been trying to describe to himself since September of 1878. "You are still here," she said. He looked at her over Daniel's small head. "I am still here," he said. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside him and put her head against his shoulder, the three of them at the window in the December dark, and the territory outside was vast and cold and beautiful and indifferent, and inside the warmth held. By the spring of 1881, the homestead had acquired 2 additional cattle, a second horse, a proper smokehouse that Marshall and Miguel Delgado had built together over a convivial October weekend, and a reputation in Cimarron Creek as a functioning and prosperous operation, rather than the precarious single-woman enterprise that Creddy had attempted to exploit. Miguel and Esperanza Delgado had become the kind of neighbors that the word neighbor was invented to describe, the kind who appear without being summoned when there is work to be done or difficulty to be addressed, and whose table was as available as one's own. Ernesto and Ruth had married in a small ceremony in February, which Ruth had organized with the same competent efficiency she brought to everything, and which had made Catherine quietly and thoroughly happy in a way that Marshall thought had something to do with the knowledge that her sister was settled and near. Dr. Haverson had become a friend in the truest sense, the kind that forms in territory where distance and difficulty are normal, and the people who choose to be reliable are remarkable for it. He came to dinner on the last Friday of the month with a regularity that had become simply part of the structure of things, and he and Marshall and Catherine talked through the evenings about the territory and its politics and its future, about the railroad coming, about what the railroad would mean for the land, and the people who had been here before it arrived, and the people it would bring. The railroad was an enormous and complicated subject in 1881. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway had pushed through to Albuquerque and was continuing south and west. And what it was doing to the territory was what it did everywhere, which was change everything with a speed that the land itself seemed to resist. It brought goods and mail and people and prices, and it brought the specific and long-standing injustice of displacement, which was the railroad's consistent companion in its passage through land that had been occupied by the Mescalero Apache and Comanche and Pueblo peoples for centuries before any American law claimed it. Marshall and Catherine talked about this as they talked about everything, honestly and without the comfortable evasions that the subject often invited in the white settler community. The dispossession was real and it was ongoing and it was wrong, and acknowledging that did not change the fact of their homestead or resolve the enormous injustice of the history, but it mattered to both of them that they did not pretend not to see it. They contributed to the Mescalero Agency Fund when they were able, and Catherine had corresponded with a woman in Washington who was organizing an advocacy effort around reservation conditions, and these were small things against a large wrong, but they were the things available to them. In the summer of 1881, Catherine told him she was expecting again, and this time he received the news with the immediate and uncomplicated joy of a man who has finished the work of learning not to be afraid. The second child was also a boy, born in January of 1882, and they named him Thomas for Marshall's father. Ruth was there for the birth, and Esperanza Delgado and Dr. Haverson, and Daniel was looked after by Miguel and Ernesto in the main room while the work happened in the back. And when it was done, and the house had quieted to the particular quiet of a newborn's first night, Marshall sat beside Catherine with Thomas asleep in the cradle, and Daniel in the bed between them, pressed warm and certain against his father's side, and Catherine looked at him across both children with those gray-green eyes and said nothing, which was the most complete and abundant thing she could have said. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was perhaps a ridiculous question given the evidence. "Monumentally," she said. "Are you?" He thought about September of 1878, the packed bag, the dark road, the rise 2 miles south from which he had looked back 7 times at the homestead light in the window. He thought about the morning of the 8th day when he had turned back from the front door instead of the road. He thought about the first time he had called it home out loud and not known he had done it. "Yes," he said. "Monumentally," she smiled. Thomas made the small sound that newborns make, the small sound of a creature newly arrived and already fully opinionated. Daniel shifted in his sleep, one small hand finding his father's arm and holding on. Outside, the January night was cold and clear, and the stars over the New Mexico territory were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and magnificent. And inside the homestead with the blue-posted porch and the kitchen garden and the cottonwood by the dry creek, the stove was warm and the house was full, and the man who had left before dawn every time had found at last and at length that the leaving was finished. He had learned it the hard way, which was the only way he knew to learn anything, that the things you love do not become safer by being kept at a distance. They become only more distant. And that the morning you find you cannot leave is not a defeat of something strong in you, but a victory of something real. The settled weight of it, the daily chosen gravity of a life with others, was not the opposite of freedom. It was the only freedom that had ever actually held him. Spring came again to the territory, as it always had and always would, the arroyos filling, the grass coming back, the blue posts on the porch needing a new coat of paint, which Marshall applied on a warm March morning with Daniel beside him, handing him the brush with the grave importance of a 3-year-old who has been given a significant responsibility. Catherine stood in the doorway with Thomas on her hip and watched them, and the morning light was on the land and on her face and on the blue paint, and the creek ran, and the cottonwood put out its first green, and everything, every ordinary miraculous thing, was exactly and entirely where it belonged. Marshall looked up from the porch post at his wife and his sons and the homestead that was his home, and he felt it the way you feel a truth you have finally stopped arguing with, complete, quiet, and absolutely certain. He had been a man who left before dawn every time, and then one morning he had found he simply could not. And the life that had begun at that exact moment, in that single act of staying, had become the only thing in 11 years of wandering that had ever felt, in every way that mattered, like arriving.